As Donald Trump and Elon Musk's shock and awe offensive continues, I think it's important that we stand back and really recognize some of the strategy behind what they're doing here, which is common across authoritarian, autocratic regimes throughout the world and throughout history. It's not just about the enactment of this terrible policy agenda. It's about the consolidation of power and control. And so much of what they're doing through the attacks on the vulnerable immigrant communities, LGBTQIA communities, is to use these culture wars. Chris Rufo has talked about this from the Manhattan Institute. Use these culture wars to drive a wedge in a pro-democracy community. Obviously, those folks are at the front line. They need our support as much as we can provide it. But beyond that, what they're trying to do is use these culture wars to drive wedges within the critical institutions that provide the infrastructure for society, pillars of support for government power. And looking around the landscape, you can see how they are using these culture wars to attack these pillars, whether it's the business community, the world of higher education, the government itself through the erosion of checks and balances and the capitulation of Congress and potentially the courts to this agenda. But perhaps no community is standing more at a crossroads right now than the legal profession, which almost stands apart from these other vital pillars of society than any, right? Because the legal profession both provides the legitimacy and the resources to either support or constrain authoritarian abuse of power. And right now, the early signs are not so great. We've seen a forceful and aggressive attack on the biggest corporate law firms in the country. These are firms that in the first Trump administration provided a good amount of pro bono support to folks that were trying to stand up against the first administration's corrupt abuse of power. And now they are being targeted one by one to either capitulate to unconstitutional and unlawful demands for compliance with the Trump MAGA agenda or be destroyed. And far too many of them have stood on the sidelines as these firms one by one have been targeted. Some, in fact, have anticipatorily made concessions to the Trump administration so as to avoid these aggressive attacks on their sort of very existence. And amid this indecision, amid this inaction from these hugely important corporate law firms, we have seen the most incredible act of bravery and courage from one junior lawyer at one of them, Skadden Arps, one of the most elite and prestigious, difficult to get into law firms in the country. This is Rachel Cohen. I'm so thrilled to have you here, Rachel. Not to be cheesy and sort of quote Star Wars, but in a very real way, you are the spark that is lighting a fire within the legal profession as it faces this crossroads and tries to set a course for a commitment to the foundational principles of American law and the rule of law, or instead, as your now former firm, Skadden Arps chose to sort of obey in advance and give its resources, give its legitimacy to the Trump administration. Can you tell us a little bit about how this went down and how you decided to speak out? You gave a conditional notice of resignation. If, as you saw the writing on the wall with some of these other firms, you told Skadden, no. Like, what's what did you say? What sort of motivated your decision to do that?
I was motivated by a desire to be proactive here. I think that there's a huge proactivity, reactivity issue in American culture broadly, but especially on the left, or maybe it's not even a right-left divide right now, right? And it's an anti-fascism kind of divide versus pro-fascism, which is kind of a crazy thing to say. But I will say I'm so grateful for the words that you've shared, and it's so kind. But I'm not the spark. I'm just the public-facing person on this. And I think that we have a really robust and wonderful community of people that are continuing to organize in whatever way feels tenable to them. And I think that that's something that I name only because, listen, I'll take my flowers. I appreciate them. People are being very, very nice to me. But I think that it's important to make it clear that people to engage do not have to engage in these huge public facing kind of actions, and that action didn't arise overnight. It's rooted in community and support. And what ultimately triggered it was that I and friends and collaborators had spent a lot of time trying to organize in the quote unquote right way and reaching out to people internally at firms and saying, hey, we're sliding into authoritarianism here. What are we doing? We have an obligation as people that are very well paid within the legal industry to stand up for the existence of the industry itself. And so we'd engaged in some other organizing actions. There was an open letter that was circulating. I was public facing on that. And then Paul Weiss, which is another large corporate law firm, reached a settlement basically with the Trump administration related to an executive order that had been put in against them in a very extra legal kind of outside the norms way. I think it's so important to continue attention on people that are being deported and these kind of actions that are being taken by the Trump admin. I also think it's important to name that many of those actions are things that they can do legally. And that doesn't make them normatively good or even normatively okay actions, just the fact that they can do them legally. But it's striking that the Trump administration is choosing to do them illegally as kind of a form of pressure test. And the executive order that was leveraged against Paul Weiss was pretty much the same thing, because a judge had entered a restraining order related to enforcement of a very, very similar executive order entered against another law firm. And instead of fighting with the roadmap laid out for them, Paul Weiss made a deal to provide $40 million in free legal services to the Trump administration, and also to kind of allow the Trump administration in to investigate hiring and recruitment and retention policies in a way that is a huge racist dog whistle. And so I see this happening, and I'm thinking on the bus home, what was the conversation like at Paul Weiss right before this happened? And then I have this like, aha, Archimedes, I've found it moment where I'm like, oh my God, the conversation was exactly the conversation that we just had at Skadden, where they were acting like they didn't know what they were going to do and that they hadn't had time to figure it out, and that, they're considering all of their options. No, that we're very smart people. We move very quickly. We contingency plan. And so if you're saying that you don't know if you're going to fight something that is incredibly easy to fight legally because it is illegal, and you're still saying that 48 hours later, I need to read between the lines and be proactive and recognize that what's coming is the reason you're not telling me is because you know that it's not what I want to hear. So how do I intervene before the bad thing happens?
Yeah, it's so interesting. And, I think these law firms in particular, Paul Weiss and Skadden Arps, it's interesting that they were the ones that made this decision, right? Paul Weiss caving after the executive order was issued, Skadden initially, without the EO, making this offer, providing $100 million in free legal to support. These are law firms that have a history of standing up for the rule of law, sort of being on the right side of history in terms of the arc of the moral universe. Paul Weiss, of course, was involved on the right side of Brown versus Board of Education. Skadden, perhaps the best, certainly the most prestigious and important law firm associated with public interest law school funding, post law funding for public interest fellows. Those are now going to seemingly be MAGA fellowships. And the dynamic there is so interesting, because even as these big corporate law firms are supporting with pro bono activities or other funding, pro-democracy, pro-equality policies, at the end of the day, you can see how much the bottom line is the driving force in their decision-making. And it's hard to really begrudge them, right? That they are businesses on some level.
It's not hard to begrudge them.
No. I just mean in a general sense, right? I don't mean in the context of this conflict here, right? In this conflict, even if they were going to lose money as a result of standing up to Trump, I think there's only one way to go about this. But I think one thing that's so illuminating about the mindset of these firms is in that a letter from Brad Karp, the chairman at Paul Weiss, where he said, this is an existential thing. We were really hoping people would stand up in support of us, but didn't happen, and so we don't have a choice here. But there's effectively zero consideration of countervailing economic considerations for capitulating, right? What does this mean in terms of their ability to recruit law students, ability to recruit clients? What kind of a client would want a lawyer who, as you say, has a very clear path to legal victory and is willing to just lie down?
Yeah, I certainly would not want to be represented by that attorney. And I think that the existential threat language from Brad Karp, I actually regret not looking this up earlier, but I finally did today so that I could make sure that I said it on recordings. The 2023 profit per equity partner at Paul Weiss was $6,574,000 profit per equity partner. And so, of course, not every equity partner at Paul Weiss is making $6.7 million a year, but they're all clearing seven figures. And I think to say that is an existential crisis because there might be a dip in profits to a certain extent is so short-sighted. And I think that what it really gets to on a fundamental level is that all of these attorneys think that they are smarter than Donald Trump. They think that they are running circles around him. They think that they can offer him up a little bit and then actually claim victory. And it's making me question the idea that they are, in fact, good negotiators and good at reading people and very smart, because I don't know how you could have a 500-page document online clearly outlining kind of the authoritarian tendencies of the Trump administration, quotes where he said that he doesn't want to leave office before he was even elected, and also just recognize that it's not 2016. This isn't a campaign where they were shocked to win and they didn't have the infrastructure in place. This is something that's been in the works for almost a decade now. And so you have people saying this is an immediate short-term threat to profits, but not taking seriously the long-term threat to profits that come from oligarchy or autocracy, where you certainly don't need 200 different large corporate law firms charging thousands of dollars an hour. And also where the person in charge of the autocracy has no respect for people who cave to him.
Yeah, I mean, I think it reflects such a short-sighted and naive view of the moment we are living in. It's been really interesting. I first saw your public letter or your letter to the firm on LinkedIn, which very sort of strangely to me, and I'm not super active there, but for the first couple of months of the administration, it just was like nothing had changed. Everybody was posting about, legal brief writing or kind of business development as if we were living in a normal world. And, after this started happening, basically after, you took this action vis-a-vis Skadden, the dynamics there have really changed. I've seen a lot more of this type of conversation and a lot of concerns being raised. And I've been part of that a little bit. And some of the pushback I have heard from people I know at big corporate law firms that are wrestling with these challenges right now is, you don't really understand. This is the right move. We have to keep our heads down so that we can live to fight another day. And my response is like, what other day is there going to be? Do you not see what is happening here? And I was pleased to see a story in the New York Times this week about how this debate is now just boiling over at so many of these firms, particularly among associates who thought that the firms they were joining had some rooted commitment to some kind of foundational values or conception of the rule of law that apparently is up for debate now. Where do you see this going from here? What can we do to, with respect to this vital pillar of American democracy, the legal profession, help right the ship, make sure that more people choose the right decision instead of the capitulating pro-autocracy decision? There are carrot strategies where you sort of like reward and praise folks that are doing the right thing, stick strategies where you publicly shame the folks that aren't. How do you think lawyers and other folks that are involved in this community can best proceed here?
I don't know that there's one certain best path forward here. I think we're not in fully uncharted territory because we've certainly seen things like this play out over history over and over again, but a little bit of uncharted territory, the nature of tech and algorithms, and I think really the breakdown of community in this country and broadly following a very extended and necessary quarantine. And so I think that there's a bunch of different ways that people can engage. And I think that if you are someone who's in the legal profession, I think that it's extremely important that you are pressuring, particularly people with more power. That's something that I'm finding a little frustrating when people come in, and I'll have partners in my comments saying, "We're so proud of you, well done." And it's gratifying to know that people in these positions of authority agree with me, but I am a bit, sometimes they come and say, "How can I support you?" And I say, "Go, you can best support me by going and doing your own thing. Do something with the people that have the power." And I understand that that sounds hard or scary or impossible, but do you think it was easier for me? Like, the whole point of this is to show that this is possible. And also, it's kind of exactly what you said. I felt like I was living in an alternate universe for the first month and a half of the Trump admin, where I would go into work, no one would be talking about anything. If I brought it up, I had conversations with people where I would say, if we don't do something, we are going to be representing the Trump administration as it argues why it should be allowed to use slave labor from people on Guantanamo Bay who have been shipped there because they received gender affirming care. And people would respond and say, "Oh God." Not even, "No, that's not what's going to happen." Just, "Oh my God, yeah."
Yeah.
In what room do you think you're in? What do you think you would do if you feel that that's a real possibility, even if you don't think that that is what's going to happen? And so I wanted to make people feel affirmed and acting differently, right? Like, if this had accomplished nothing beyond people saying, "Wow, someone is taking this as seriously as it feels like maybe we should be taking it," that's a win. And so I think that high level, the answer is act differently. And that doesn't mean that you quit. It doesn't mean that, though two other people at Skadden have, I'm very proud of them, but no pressure. They were positioned where they could. But it doesn't mean you quit, but it means that you don't just go around and pretend that this isn't happening because it's scary. And that looks different for lawyers and for clients and for people that are not in the industry. But I think that the most important thing is that, especially if you're new to organizing, you're a white person that's very into institutions, like many attorneys are, I think that it's so important to take a step and actually not act immediately, and instead learn from people who have been organizing for a very long time, primarily Indigenous and Black people in the United States, and understand that these kind of fascist tendencies that are now impacting all of us have impacted those people for a very long time. Read some Leonard Pelletier, read, some Miriam Kaba. And I think in doing that, and in building community, and in really letting yourself come up with a theory of change, and letting yourself dream of a future that is not the really terrifying one that I just outlined as a possibility, that is foundational work that it's important to be doing if you haven't done it yet. And it's actually really joyful and depressing sometimes, but also really fun to build community and engage in that way.
Yeah, and I think that is the work of our time, right? There's going to be more darkness ahead,
Yep.
and the way to the light is through that type of work, right? That the community building, the creation of structures, networks, visions, and ideas that can liberate us, that can build a democracy better than the one we had before, right? Always imperfect, always deeply flawed. And, I think that, in inflection points like this, as scary and terrible as they are, there are those seeds, not to get super cheesy again, but, those seeds of hope, right? That we can start to water. So Rachel, I can't thank you enough for, obviously this was, not a sort of like one-off, unthought through kind of fluky thing you did here, but deeply considered and brave. And very clearly, as you said, sort of on behalf in some way of a huge chorus of people behind you that are navigating these difficult waters.
And I think it's also, I'll leave us here, or if we I think we're coming up on time, but I do just want to say there's this notion, even in the coverage of kind of what I've done here, it feels very sacrificial and hard, and like to care about things is really challenging and hard. And it's hard sometimes, but also my friends threw me a brunch this weekend They pulled it together. They said, will this be stressful for you? And I said, yes, if it's at a restaurant, but no, if it's at someone's house. And immediately it was planned at someone's house. And like 30 people showed up, and somebody showed up with a cake that says Jeremy London is a loser, who's the executive partner of Skadden Harps, who just made that deal. And it was so fun. And I think it's not a fun time to exist, but honestly, the parts that are fun are building joyful resistance, whether that's in the legal community or anywhere else.
Amen to that. Jeremy London is a loser.
He's such a loser.
We would love to have you back anytime. I can't wait to see where this takes you. Thank you so much for joining us here on Midas Touch VLAF. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We are cruising through past 500,000 subscribers, adding more and more to this great community every day. See you next time.
Thanks so much.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.